Meg Murray stood on the front porch, staring into the storm that swirled ominously outside. It was an unusually dark night, and the wind howled like something was trying to get in. Her thoughts were scattered, weighed down by the constant reminder that her father had been missing for so long, without a trace. People whispered that he had abandoned the family, but Meg knew better. She felt it deep within her, a connection to him that remained, no matter how distant. As the rain beat against the windows, her younger brother, Charles Wallace, sat calmly at the kitchen table. He was a strange, gifted child, different from anyone Meg had ever known. His eerie calmness unnerved her sometimes, as if he knew things no one else did. That night, as the storm raged, Charles Wallace looked up from his book, his gaze locking onto Meg's. "They're coming," he said quietly. Meg's heart raced. Before she could ask what he meant, a knock came at the door. It wasn't a polite knock, but more like a deep, resounding thud, as if the storm itself had taken form and was demanding entrance. Without hesitation, Charles Wallace got up and opened the door, revealing the oddest figure Meg had ever seen, a tall, lanky woman dressed in clothes that didn't belong to any era. Her name was Mrs. Watsit, and she stepped into the house without any preamble. Mrs. Watsit brought with her an air of mystery. She spoke in riddles, but one thing was clear: she knew something about their father. Meg's pulse quickened. Could this strange visitor be the key to finding him? Mrs. Watsit didn't linger long, but before she left, she mentioned something called a tesseract. Meg didn't know what it meant, but Charles Wallace seemed to understand. The next day, they found themselves at the house of Mrs. Watsit's companions, Mrs. Who and Mrs. Witch, two equally strange women who, together with Mrs. Watsit, were not exactly human. They revealed that Meg's father had been experimenting with travel through dimensions, and something had gone wrong. He had been captured by an evil force that was spreading across the universe, consuming planets and trapping the minds of those who resisted it. The force was known as IT, and it had a power that transcended time and space. Before Meg could fully process what was happening, Mrs. Witch extended her hand toward her. "It's time to go," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as if it came from every direction at once. And then, in a flash, the world around them bent, twisted, and folded in on itself. Meg felt as if her very body had been pulled through a tunnel of light. Her stomach lurched, and when she opened her eyes, she wasn't standing in her living room anymore. They had arrived on a distant planet, one where the sky shimmered in colors she had never seen before. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with life. Everything felt surreal, yet oddly peaceful. But this peace was only temporary, as they soon encountered a group of strange beings, tall, winged creatures with soft, glowing eyes. One of them, a being named Ant Beast, communicated with them telepathically, reassuring Meg that her father was still alive, but imprisoned on a dark planet where IT ruled. Time was running out. IT's influence was spreading rapidly, and if they didn't find her father soon, not only would they lose him, but the universe itself could be consumed. With Mrs. Watsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch guiding them, Meg, Charles Wallace, and their friend Calvin O'Keefe tessered again, this time to the heart of the evil force. The planet they landed on was cold and desolate, filled with an eerie silence. The closer they got to IT, the more they could feel its oppressive presence, like a weight pressing down on their minds. Meg could feel it too, an urge to give in, to surrender to the overwhelming darkness. But she fought it, clinging to her love for her father and the belief that he was still out there, waiting for her. Charles Wallace, however, wasn't so lucky. IT sensed the power in him, the brilliance of his mind, and before Meg realized what was happening, Charles Wallace was taken. He stood motionless, his eyes vacant, as if his entire self had been consumed by the evil force. Meg screamed, reaching out for her brother, but he was no longer there. Despair washed over her, but Mrs. Watsit's words echoed in her mind, "You have something IT does not." Meg didn't understand at first, but then it hit her. IT operated on fear, control, and domination. It lacked one essential thing: love. That was her weapon. Love for her father, love for Charles Wallace, love for Calvin. She could feel it building within her, like a warmth radiating from her heart. She approached her brother, standing just a few feet from IT itself, the massive brain-like structure pulsing with malevolence. IT tried to pull her into its web, to make her submit, but Meg held fast, reaching out to Charles Wallace with all the love she could muster. She spoke to him, not with words, but with feelings, memories, and everything they had ever shared. Slowly, she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The battle between IT and Meg wasn't one of strength or intelligence, it was one of emotion. IT grew agitated, sensing that its grip on Charles Wallace was slipping. Meg pushed harder, reminding Charles of who he was, of the love that surrounded him, and then, in a flash, he was back. Charles Wallace gasped, blinking as if waking from a long sleep. IT roared, furious at its defeat, but it was too late. Meg grabbed her brother's hand, and in that moment, something incredible happened. The Tesseract activated, pulling them both away from the dark planet. As they hurtled through dimensions once more, Meg could feel IT's presence fading, its power weakening with each passing second. When they landed, they were back on Earth, standing in a meadow filled with sunlight. Her father was there, alive and free, waiting for them with open arms. The relief was overwhelming, but Meg knew the fight wasn't over. IT had been defeated, but not destroyed. It was out there, somewhere, waiting to strike again. But for now, they were together. And that was enough. As they stood in the warm embrace of the meadow, basking in the sunlight and the reunion with their father, Meg couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in the back of her mind. The peace felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Her father, Dr. Murray, looked worn and tired, as though the ordeal had taken years off his life. But his smile, full of pride and relief, gave Meg a brief moment of comfort. She held Charles Wallace tightly, not wanting to let go, as if by holding him, she could keep the darkness at bay. But the sky above them rippled slightly, just a flicker, as if reality itself had wavered. Meg noticed it, but before she could say anything, the air shimmered again, and a cold dread washed over her. "Do you feel that?" Calvin whispered, his voice low, as though speaking louder might awaken something lurking nearby. Dr. Murray's face tensed. He had noticed it too. "We don't have much time," he said gravely, his voice filled with urgency. "IT isn't gone. It's retreating, yes, but it will come back stronger. It always does." Meg's heart raced. "What do we do? We just got you back. How do we stop IT for good?" Dr. Murray glanced around, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. "There's more to this than just IT, he said carefully. "I've seen things, Meg. Things beyond what even the Tesseract can show us. Forces at work that are deeper, older than IT. What we've faced so far is only a fraction of the real threat. There's something much darker, a force that IT serves." A chill ran down Meg's spine. Charles Wallace, still silent, was staring off into the distance, his expression distant, as if he could already sense what was coming. Before anyone could react, the meadow shifted. The warmth of the sun was replaced by a creeping cold, and the landscape around them began to distort. It was as if reality itself was bending, stretching, twisting into something unrecognizable. The grass beneath their feet faded, replaced by a barren, desolate land. The sky turned a deep, unnatural shade of red, streaked with black clouds that moved like tendrils. Mrs. Watsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which appeared suddenly, materializing out of the warped air. They looked more serious than Meg had ever seen them, their usual whimsy gone, replaced by an air of grim determination. "It has begun," Mrs. Watsit said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "What's happening?" Meg asked, panic rising in her chest. "Where are we? What is this?" "This is the in-between," Mrs. Who replied cryptically. "A place where realities merge and tear apart. IT has retreated here, but not of its own will. It is being summoned, drawn by a greater force." Mrs. Which nodded, her form flickering. "You have defeated IT for now, but this force, it seeks to consume everything, not just worlds, but dimensions themselves. We brought you here because you must see it with your own eyes." Meg's heart pounded as the landscape continued to twist and shift around them. She could feel the pull of something immense, a presence so vast and terrifying that it defied comprehension. Ahead of them, a dark chasm opened in the ground, and from it, a massive, swirling vortex emerged. The sheer power radiating from it was overwhelming, and at the center of it all, IT's dark, pulsing form hovered, trapped yet empowered by the greater force surrounding it. What is that?" Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible. "That," Mrs. Watson said gravely, "is the true enemy. The darkness beyond. IT is merely an agent of its will." Meg stared at the vortex, her stomach twisting in knots. The darkness emanating from it felt alive, sentient, as though it was aware of their presence. And yet, despite its terrifying power, she felt something else within it, something that felt disturbingly familiar. Charles Wallace stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the swirling mass. "It's calling to me," he said softly, his voice hollow. "No!" Meg cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't go near it." But Charles Wallace didn't move. His expression was distant, almost hypnotized. "It's not just calling me. It's calling all of us. It knows us. It's been watching us, waiting." Dr. Murray's face went pale. "No, Charles Wallace. You must resist. This force, it's far older than we imagined. It's been feeding off the universe for eons. IT was just a tool, but this is the source of all that darkness." Meg could feel the pull now, too. It wasn't just a force of destruction, it was a force of seduction, whispering promises of power, of knowledge, of control over time and space itself. She could see flashes of alternate realities, glimpses of what could be, worlds where her family was whole, where there was no pain, no fear. "No," Meg said, shaking her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "This isn't real. It's trying to manipulate us." Mrs. Watson placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are right, Meg. This is the final test. The darkness beyond seeks to unravel the very fabric of existence. It will show you every desire, every fear, to make you submit." Meg tightened her grip on Charles Wallace's arm, pulling him back. "We won't give in." But as the vortex continued to grow, its power intensifying, Meg knew they couldn't face this alone. They had only just scratched the surface of the true battle that lay ahead. The darkness beyond was far more powerful than anything they had ever encountered, and its influence was spreading, warping reality itself. Mrs. Watson, and Mrs. Witch exchanged grim looks. "You must choose," Mrs. Witch said. "To fight this force means risking everything, even your very existence. But if you don't, the universe will fall." Meg's heart raced as the weight of the decision pressed down on her. Could she face something this powerful? Could any of them? But as she looked at Charles Wallace, Calvin, and her father, she knew the answer. They had no choice. They would fight. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Meg steeled herself, feeling the immense weight of the decision hanging in the air. The vortex before them churned like a living thing, radiating malice and beckoning them to succumb to its power. She could feel it creeping into her mind, offering her visions of a perfect world where all their struggles were erased. She could see her mother, happy and reunited with her father. She could see Charles Wallace, free from the darkness that had tried to consume him. The temptation gnawed at her, but she fought back, clenching her fists. "No," she muttered under her breath. "This isn't real. None of it is real." But Charles Wallace's expression remained distant. His wide eyes locked on the swirling mass as though transfixed by something only he could see. "It's not lying, Meg," he whispered. "It's showing us what could be. It's not just a trick." Dr. Murray stepped forward, alarm etched across his face. "Charles, you must fight it. It's using those visions to break you. It's showing you what you want to see, but it will twist it into something monstrous." But Charles Wallace didn't seem to hear him. His small hands reached out, trembling as if he was being drawn toward the center of the vortex, closer and closer to IT and the terrifying force beyond it. No! Meg screamed, grabbing her brother's shoulders and pulling him back, her heart pounding. You can't listen to it, Charles. Remember what we've been through. This isn't us. For a moment, Charles Wallace's eyes flickered with recognition, but then the pull of the dark force resumed. The visions intensified, now invading all their minds. Calvin gasped, backing away as his own desires and fears began to take form in front of him. He saw his own family, whole and loving, something he'd never known. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake the illusion, but the images grew stronger. We need to stop this now, Calvin said, his voice shaking. It's trying to trap us. Mrs. Watson, her face lined with sorrow, turned to Meg. You've done all you can here. We must leave this place. Meg shook her head furiously. We can't just leave. We're so close to stopping IT, to stopping all of this. We have to end it. Mrs. Witch, her voice low and steady, intervened. This force is far beyond anything you can comprehend, Meg. You are not ready to face it. But there is a way to weaken it. To buy time. Dr. Murray looked at the three celestial beings, desperation etched in his features. What do we need to do? There is a place, Mrs. Wu said softly, a place beyond the reach of time itself. A dimension untouched by IT and the darkness beyond. There, you will find what you need to defeat it. Meg frowned, confused. But how do we even get there? Mrs. Watson's expression turned somber. You will have to test her farther than you ever have before, Meg. Farther than you've ever dreamed. Meg felt a surge of fear mixed with determination. She remembered the first time she had tessered, how disorienting it had been. The very idea of traveling farther, to places she couldn't even imagine, sent a shiver down her spine. But if this was the only way to stop the darkness beyond, she knew they had to try. As the vortex loomed larger, Meg glanced at her father, Charles Wallace, and Calvin. They had been through so much together, faced dangers that no one else could understand. And yet, this challenge felt different, larger, more insurmountable. But there was no turning back now. What do we need to do? She asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Watson extended her hand. Hold on to each other. Trust the process. And, Meg, remember that you are stronger than you know. With a final, determined glance at her family, Meg took Mrs. Watson's hand. Charles Wallace and Calvin followed suit, linking hands as the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air shimmered once more, but this time it wasn't the menacing pull of the vortex. It was something else, something warmer, more familiar. The world around them dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors, swirling in patterns that defied logic. Meg felt herself stretching, pulling in every direction at once, and yet, she remained anchored by the hands of her loved ones. The sensation was dizzying, overwhelming, but she focused on Mrs. Watson's words, "You are stronger than you know." When the world finally stopped spinning, they were no longer standing in the warped meadow. Instead, they found themselves in a place that seemed both ancient and impossibly new. The sky was a swirling mix of purples and blues, the ground beneath their feet shimmering like glass. Strange, ethereal structures rose in the distance, casting long shadows that danced in the soft, glowing light. Where are we? Calvin whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. This, Mrs. Wu replied, is the place where time stands still. The source of all that was, is, and will be. Meg gazed around, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what she was seeing. It was as if they had stepped into a place that existed beyond the constraints of reality itself. The air buzzed with energy, and yet, there was an eerie stillness to everything, as though the universe was holding its breath. Charles Wallace, his eyes wide with wonder, stepped forward. This is it, he said softly. This is where we'll find what we need. But even as they took in the strange beauty of the place, Meg couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The darkness beyond hadn't followed them here, but its presence still loomed over them like a shadow, waiting, biding its time. We need to be quick, Dr. Murray warned. This place is safe for now, but the darkness will find a way. Mrs. Watson nodded. Indeed. Time is no ally here, but it is also not your enemy. What you seek lies at the heart of this place. But be warned, what you find may not be what you expect. Meg swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what awaited them, but she knew one thing for certain: they had come too far to turn back now. And as they began their journey deeper into the timeless realm, the weight of their mission settled heavily on her shoulders. The fate of everything, of every world, every dimension, rested on what they would find here. And Meg wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead. As they ventured deeper into the timeless realm, Meg felt a growing unease. The strange beauty of the place couldn't mask the unsettling feeling that it wasn't entirely safe. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of their mission, the shimmering ground beneath them humming softly with some ancient power. Calvin and Dr. Murray kept close, their eyes darting around warily, while Charles Wallace moved ahead with an eerie calm, as if he knew exactly where they were going. "What do we do when we get there?" Calvin asked, breaking the tense silence. "How are we supposed to use whatever we find to stop the darkness beyond?" Mrs. Watson glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "The answer will reveal itself when the time is right." "That's not exactly comforting," Calvin muttered under his breath, but Meg understood. Nothing about this journey had been clear or easy, and it wasn't going to be now. They had to trust that the pieces would fall into place when they needed them most. As they continued walking, the landscape around them began to shift subtly. The ethereal structures in the distance grew taller, more defined, their towering forms casting long, shifting shadows over the group. Meg noticed that the light in the sky had dimmed slightly, though no sun or moon could be seen. Everything seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, timeless, yet somehow fragile. Charles Wallace suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed ahead. "We're close," he whispered, his voice trembling with an emotion Meg couldn't quite place. Meg followed his line of sight and saw it, an enormous, glowing structure at the heart of the realm. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, pulsating with energy and casting strange, flickering patterns of light across the ground. It looked alive, as though the very fabric of the universe was woven into its walls. Dr. Murray stepped forward, his breath catching. This is the source of all time," he said in awe, his voice barely above a whisper. "The nexus where every thread of existence converges." Meg stared at the structure, feeling a mixture of fear and wonder. This was what they had come for. This was the place where they would find the key to stopping the darkness beyond. But as they approached the entrance to the nexus, a sudden chill swept over Meg. She glanced around, her heart racing. Something wasn't right. The air felt too still, too heavy. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Calvin nodded, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Yeah, it's like we're being watched." Mrs. Watson's eyes narrowed as she scanned the horizon. "We are not alone here." And then, before any of them could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the swirling light. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. But Meg could feel its power, its malice, radiating from it in waves. "You should not have come here," the figure said, its voice low and menacing, echoing across the realm like a distant thunder. Meg took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, its form rippling with the strange, shifting light of the nexus. "I am the guardian of this place," it said, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. "And I cannot allow you to proceed." Charles Wallace stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "We have to. We're here to stop the darkness beyond. This is the only way." The Guardian's gaze turned toward Charles Wallace, and for a moment, it seemed to hesitate. "The darkness beyond, it cannot be stopped. It has always existed and always will." Meg clenched her fists, stepping forward to stand beside her brother. "We won't let that happen. We'll find a way." The Guardian's form seemed to shift again, its cloak of shadows swirling around it like a living thing. "You are fools to think you can alter the fate of the universe. The threads of time are delicate, and your interference will only lead to destruction." Meg's heart raced, But she refused to back down. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. She wouldn't let fear stop her now. We're not leaving until we've done what we came to do. The Guardian stared at them for a long moment, its shadowy form silent and still. Then, slowly, it raised a hand, and the air around them began to vibrate with a low, ominous hum. The nexus itself seemed to respond, the light within it growing brighter, more chaotic. "You leave me no choice," the Guardian said, its voice now laced with anger. "You will not leave this place." Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled, and a dark wave of energy surged from the Guardian's outstretched hand. Meg barely had time to react before the wave hit them, sending her and the others sprawling across the ground. She struggled to her feet, her head spinning, the world around her a blur of light and shadow. The Guardian loomed over them, its form growing larger, more menacing. "Meg!" Calvin shouted, grabbing her arm. "We have to move." But before they could retreat, the air around them shimmered, and suddenly, a familiar voice echoed through the realm. "Stop!" Meg's eyes widened as a figure stepped into view, a figure she recognized immediately. It was her father. Dr. Murray gasped, his eyes wide with shock. How is this possible?" The figure smiled, but there was something off about it, something cold and calculated. "I have been waiting for you," it said, its voice eerily calm. "I have seen the threads of time, and I know what must be done." Meg's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't her father. It couldn't be. Something was terribly wrong. "What are you?" she demanded, stepping forward, her fists clenched. "What do you want?" The figure's smile widened, and it began to change, its form flickering like a dying flame. "I am the one who will bring balance," it said, its voice growing deeper, darker. "I am the key to the future." Before Meg could react, the figure lunged toward her, its hand outstretched, reaching for the nexus. Meg barely had time to react as the figure lunged forward, its hand outstretched toward the nexus. The shimmering structure pulsed in response, and for a split second, time itself seemed to warp and stretch around them. Her instincts kicked in, and she threw herself in front of her father's doppelganger, blocking its path. The sheer force of the impact sent her sprawling backward, but she quickly scrambled to her feet. "Meg, stop!" Calvin shouted, grabbing her arm. "You can't fight it." But she wasn't listening. Something primal surged within her, a desperate need to protect the nexus, to stop this imposter from seizing control. Her father's face, no, the twisted version of it, hovered in front of her, its expression unreadable. "You think you understand time," the figure hissed, its voice an eerie mockery of her father's. "But you are just a child, playing in a sandbox far beyond your comprehension." Meg felt a chill crawl down her spine. The figure's presence was suffocating, as if it was drawing energy from the very air around them. She glanced at Charles Wallace, hoping he might know what to do. But her brother stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the figure as if seeing something she couldn't. "Charles," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Charles Wallace's gaze flickered to her, his usual calm replaced by something close to fear. "It's not just the nexus, Meg. It's using the threads of time itself to take control. If we let it reach the nexus, it'll rewrite everything." Her heart sank. They were outmatched. This wasn't a battle they could win with brute strength. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not after everything they'd been through. "No," she muttered under her breath. "We can stop this." She took a deep breath, her mind racing. The nexus was the key, its power could bend time, reshape reality. But that power was also its greatest danger. If the figure gained control, it could unravel everything they knew, erasing entire realities in its wake. Suddenly, an idea sparked in her mind. It was risky, reckless even, but it was all they had. She turned to Calvin and Charles Wallace, her eyes blazing with determination. "We need to trick it," she said quickly. "If it's drawing energy from the nexus, we can use that against it. We lure it in, let it think it's won, and then..." "And then what?" Calvin interrupted, his voice strained. What if we can't stop it in time? We don't have a choice, Meg shot back. If we do nothing, it'll rewrite everything. We'll lose Dad, the universe, everything. Charles Wallace nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. She's right. If we can disrupt the flow of time within the nexus, we might be able to trap it. But we'll need to act fast. The figure loomed closer, its dark form flickering as it advanced. The air around them crackled with energy, and Meg could feel the pull of the nexus growing stronger, as if it was calling out to her. With a determined nod, she locked eyes with the figure. Come on then, she said, her voice steady. Let's end this. The figure hesitated for a moment, its hollow eyes narrowing as it studied her. You are brave, little one, it said softly, almost mockingly. But bravery will not save you. Ignoring the taunt, Meg took a step forward, drawing the figure's attention. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground, waiting for the right moment. Now, she shouted. In an instant, Charles Wallace surged forward, his hand outstretched toward the nexus. The air around him shimmered, and suddenly, the entire realm shifted. Time itself seemed to ripple and warp, bending under the weight of the nexus's power. The figure roared in fury, its form flickering wildly as it struggled to maintain control. But Meg didn't give it a chance. With a burst of energy, she lunged forward, her hand brushing against the glowing surface of the nexus. For a brief, blinding moment, everything went white. Meg felt a surge of power rush through her, overwhelming her senses. She was no longer standing on solid ground, but floating in a sea of light, surrounded by endless possibilities. And then, just as quickly, it was over. The figure was gone. The realm had returned to its strange, shimmering stillness. Meg stood frozen, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. Is it over? Calvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Meg looked around, her heart still racing. I don't know, she said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing. No dark presence, no looming threat. Just the nexus, glowing softly in the distance. We did it, Charles Wallace said, his voice calm but tired. We stopped it. Meg wanted to believe him, but something in the air still felt wrong. The nexus's light seemed dimmer, its energy more unstable than before. She could feel it, something wasn't right. And then, out of the silence, a voice echoed softly in her mind. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. Meg's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't over. The danger was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of reality, waiting for its next move. Meg's pulse quickened as the ominous voice lingered in her mind, fading into a whisper yet unmistakably real. She shot a glance at Calvin and Charles Wallace, but they didn't seem to hear it. She clenched her fists, steadying herself. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't been defeated, it was biding its time. We need to move, she said, her voice a low whisper, almost afraid that speaking too loudly might draw the attention of whatever malevolent force still lingered. The nexus might not hold it back for long. Calvin nodded, his face pale but resolute. Where do we go? What's left? His voice cracked slightly, betraying the exhaustion that had been creeping up on all of them. Charles Wallace, who usually had an answer for everything, stood unusually quiet. His gaze remained fixed on the glowing nexus, his brow furrowed as if he could sense something the others couldn't. It's shifting, he murmured, almost to himself. The nexus is changing. Meg felt it too, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air around them. The nexus, once a glowing beacon of control, now flickered uneasily. She reached out, instinctively brushing her hand along its surface, and for the briefest second, she saw something, not just light or energy, but glimpses of worlds beyond, places unfamiliar and yet unnervingly connected to her. Suddenly, Charles Wallace's hand gripped her arm, snapping her out of the vision. Meg! We have to go. But before she could move, a surge of energy erupted from the nexus, sending all three of them stumbling backward. The ground beneath them trembled, and fissures of light cracked open the space around them. Time, reality, everything began to distort once again. Calvin cursed under his breath, scrambling to his feet. "What now?" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. And then, from the cracks in the nexus, something emerged. Not the dark figure from before, but a silhouette, faint at first, but growing more distinct with every passing second. It was human-shaped, but twisted, as though it was caught between worlds. Its presence radiated a terrifying, unearthly energy. Meg's heart leaped into her throat. This was different. Whatever this was, it was far more dangerous than anything they'd encountered before. The air around them vibrated, the sheer power emanating from the figure bending time and space to its will. Charles Wallace stepped in front of her, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "It's a gatekeeper," he said quietly. "A guardian of the nexus. It's here because we disrupted the flow of time." The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, locked onto Meg. There was something cold and calculating in that gaze, like it could see through her very soul. "You have meddled in the threads of time," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. "And now you must pay the price." Before Meg could react, the ground beneath them shattered completely, and they were plunged into a freefall. She screamed as the world spun around her, a swirling vortex of colors and shapes, none of it making sense. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against something solid, Calvin's hand. He held onto her tightly, and for a moment, that was enough to keep her grounded in the chaos. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, they landed. The world snapped back into focus, and they found themselves standing in an unfamiliar place, the nexus nowhere to be seen. The landscape around them was barren, cold, and eerily quiet. It was as if they had been thrown into the aftermath of some great cosmic disaster. Meg pulled herself to her feet, her body aching from the fall. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. Charles Wallace was already scanning the horizon, his expression grim. "We've been displaced," he said, his voice barely audible. "We're no longer in our own dimension." Meg felt her stomach drop. Displaced? In another dimension? The weight of that realization hit her hard. They had no idea where they were, or how to get back. And worse, the gatekeeper, the being that had emerged from the nexus, was still out there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic noise cut through the silence. Meg whipped around, her heart racing. From the shadows of the desolate landscape, figures began to appear. They were tall, humanoid, but their movements were unnatural, jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "We need to run," Calvin whispered urgently. But before they could move, the figures stopped in unison. One of them stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on Meg. "You are not supposed to be here," it said, its voice a mechanical rasp. "You have broken the laws of time." Meg swallowed hard, her mind racing for a solution. How could they fight this? They had no weapons, no plan, and they were stranded in a dimension they didn't understand. But then, an idea struck her, a risky, dangerous idea. "We didn't break anything," she said, stepping forward, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her chest. "We're here to fix what's broken." The figures paused, as if considering her words. Behind her, Calvin and Charles Wallace exchanged nervous glances. "Meg, what are you doing?" Calvin hissed under his breath. She ignored him, her eyes still locked on the figure in front of her. "Take us to your leader," she said boldly, hoping that her gamble would pay off. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the figures parted, revealing a massive, towering structure in the distance. It pulsed with the same eerie energy as the nexus, and Meg knew, instinctively, that whatever they were about to face, it would change everything. But there was no turning back now. Not for Meg, not for any of them. The towering structure loomed ahead, its pulsating energy casting strange, fluctuating shadows across the barren landscape. Meg's heart raced as they moved forward, flanked by the hollow-eyed figures. She could feel Calvin and Charles Wallace close behind her, their presence both comforting and a reminder of the immense responsibility now resting on her shoulders. As they approached the entrance, the air around them grew colder, heavier, almost suffocating. The gatekeeper's voice still echoed in Meg's mind, warning them about the disruption of the timelines. Whatever lay beyond those doors would be tied to the answers they so desperately needed, about her father, about the nexus, and about the dark force that had been chasing them through time and space. The entrance to the structure was seamless, as though it had been carved from a single piece of stone. But as Meg and the others neared, the surface shimmered, then parted like liquid metal, revealing a long, dark corridor that stretched into the unknown. "This feels like a trap," Calvin muttered under his breath, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "It probably is," Meg admitted, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened with each step. Charles Wallace, quiet until now, finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I don't think they would trap us here, not like this. They need something from us. We've interfered in their realm, disrupted their order. They want to test us, to see if we understand what's at stake." Meg glanced at him, seeing the seriousness in his eyes, and nodded. "Whatever this is, we face it together." The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, a suffocating silence pressing down on them as they moved deeper into the heart of the structure. Then, suddenly, the walls began to glow with strange symbols, shifting, ancient characters that pulsed with energy. They were unlike anything Meg had ever seen, yet they felt oddly familiar, as if she had encountered them in some forgotten dream. "What is this?" Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible. Charles Wallace, ever perceptive, stopped in front of one of the glowing symbols. "It's a language, older than any we've ever known. It's speaking to us." Meg's brow furrowed. "Speaking? How?" Charles Wallace reached out, his fingers brushing against the shimmering symbols. As soon as he made contact, the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves into a form that Meg could understand. Images flooded her mind, visions of worlds beyond imagination, of timelines converging and splitting, of dimensions folding in on themselves. And in the center of it all, the nexus, a source of unimaginable power, but also of terrifying destruction. "They've been watching us," Charles Wallace murmured. "Not just now, but across all dimensions, all timelines. They've been waiting for this moment." Meg's stomach churned. Waiting for what? Before Charles Wallace could answer, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. In the center of the room, a massive, pulsating sphere hovered, its surface alive with swirling colors and patterns. It was like nothing Meg had ever seen, a living representation of time and space itself, folding and unfolding before her eyes. "We've found the heart of the nexus," Charles Wallace whispered. Meg took a cautious step forward, her eyes locked on the sphere. This was it. This was the key to everything, the nexus, her father's disappearance, the strange forces that had been chasing them. But as she neared the sphere, a sudden, sharp pain shot through her mind, and she staggered back, clutching her head. "Meg!" Calvin shouted, rushing to her side. "I'm fine," she gasped, though her head throbbed with an intensity that made it hard to think. But as she straightened, she realized the truth: the nexus wasn't just a source of power. It was alive. It was aware. And it was reaching out to her. Before she could react, the sphere began to pulse faster, and the room filled with a deep, resonant hum. The air crackled with energy, and Meg felt the pull of the nexus, drawing her closer, pulling her into its orbit. She tried to resist, but the force was too strong. "Meg, don't!" Calvin shouted, but his voice seemed distant, muffled by the overwhelming presence of the nexus. As Meg was drawn toward the sphere, she saw flashes of alternate realities, worlds where she had made different choices, where her father had never disappeared, where she had never set foot on this dangerous journey. It was tempting, so tempting to reach out and take control, to rewrite the timeline and fix everything that had gone wrong. But deep down, Meg knew it wasn't that simple. The nexus was not just a tool, it was a force of nature, unpredictable and uncontrollable. To wield its power was to risk everything, not just her own reality, but all realities. "I won't do it," she whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of the decision. "I won't let it control me." And with that, she pulled back, breaking free of the Nexus's grasp. The sphere pulsed violently, its surface rippling with agitation, but it did not pull her in again. Charles Wallace stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "You did the right thing, Meg. But we're not done yet. The Nexus has shown us its heart, but now we have to find a way to stop it." Meg nodded, her mind racing. The Nexus was too powerful to destroy outright, but maybe there was another way, something they hadn't considered. The answers were here, hidden within the symbols and the energy of the Nexus. They just had to find them before it was too late. And as they stood there, facing the pulsing heart of the Nexus, Meg knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The Nexus pulsed ominously, casting a flickering glow across the chamber. Meg took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of the cosmic force around her. She could sense the power within the Nexus, a swirling storm of energy and potential, but also a deep undercurrent of something darker, an ancient malevolence that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. "We have to find a way to disconnect it," Meg said, her voice steady, though her mind raced with uncertainty. "If we leave it like this, it will consume everything." Charles Wallace was already studying the symbols that danced along the walls, his brilliant mind working faster than Meg could follow. "There's a pattern here," he muttered, "a sequence. The Nexus isn't just raw power. It's following a set of rules, and if we can figure out what those rules are, we can disrupt the entire system." Calvin stepped up beside them, his eyes wide with both awe and fear. "But how do we do that?" "It's alive, Meg. It's like it knows we're trying to stop it." Meg nodded grimly. "That's why we have to be smarter. It wants us to think there's only one way, but we've seen the alternatives. We know there are other possibilities." The room began to vibrate, a low rumble shaking the ground beneath them. The Nexus pulsed faster, its energy growing more erratic. Meg knew they didn't have much time. If they couldn't stop it, the Nexus would spiral out of control, ripping apart not just their reality but all of them, every dimension, every alternate timeline. Everything would be lost. As they moved closer to the pulsating sphere, Charles Wallace's eyes suddenly widened. "Wait, I see it now," he exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of glowing symbols near the far wall. "The Nexus has a central control point. If we can reach it, we might be able to sever its connection to the dimensional folds." Meg's heart raced. "How do we get to it?" "It's protected by layers of energy," Charles Wallace explained. "We have to find a way to weaken its defenses before we can reach the core." Meg stared at the shifting symbols, her mind racing. There had to be a way to break through. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus, to clear her thoughts. And then, it came to her, a memory from their journey through the dimensions, a fragment of a vision she had seen when they first encountered the Nexus. "The vibrations," she whispered. "We need to disrupt the frequency of the energy field." Charles Wallace's eyes lit up. "Of course. If we can create a counter-frequency, it might destabilize the Nexus long enough for us to access the control point." "But how?" Calvin asked. "We don't have any equipment, nothing to generate a signal that strong." Meg took a deep breath. "We don't need equipment. We've traveled through time and space. We've seen the fabric of the universe itself. We can tap into that." Calvin looked skeptical, but Charles Wallace nodded in agreement. "She's right. We've already been affected by the Nexus. We're connected to it, whether we like it or not. If we focus, if we concentrate hard enough, we might be able to resonate with its energy." Meg placed her hands on the ground, feeling the hum of the energy beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift, reaching out to the flow of the Nexus. The power was overwhelming, but she could sense it, feel the subtle shifts in its frequency. It was like tuning into a cosmic signal, finding the exact wavelength that resonated with the core of the Nexus. "I feel it," Meg whispered, her voice distant. "I can hear it." Calvin and Charles Wallace knelt beside her, their hands touching the floor. Together, they focused, their minds aligning with the flow of energy. The vibrations in the room grew stronger, more chaotic, but they kept their focus, searching for the counter-frequency that would disrupt the nexus. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air. The energy field around the nexus flickered, its shimmering surface rippling like disturbed water. "It's working!" Charles Wallace shouted. Meg's eyes snapped open. "We have to move now." The three of them scrambled to their feet, racing toward the core of the nexus. The energy field was weakening, its protective layers crumbling under the pressure of their counter-frequency. But as they drew closer, the nexus responded, lashing out with tendrils of energy that crackled through the air, trying to stop them. Meg ducked under a whip of energy, her heart pounding. "Keep going," she shouted, pushing forward. They reached the base of the nexus, where the control point pulsed with a faint, flickering light. Charles Wallace reached out, his fingers hovering over the controls. "I just need a second." But before he could touch it, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows. Meg's blood ran cold. It was the dark force, the malevolent presence she had sensed from the beginning. It had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was here, ready to stop them. "You think you can stop me?" the figure hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Meg stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "We know enough." The dark figure laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You are nothing but children, playing with forces you cannot understand. The nexus will consume you, just as it has consumed countless others before you." But Meg stood her ground, her eyes blazing with determination. "We won't let that happen." The dark figure lunged toward them, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. But before it could reach them, Charles Wallace slammed his hand down on the control point, sending a shockwave of energy through the chamber. The dark figure let out a scream of rage as the energy pulsed through it, shattering its form. The nexus flickered wildly, its surface destabilizing, the tendrils of energy retracting. "We did it," Calvin gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. But Meg knew it wasn't over yet. The nexus was still pulsing, still connected to the dimensional folds. They had weakened it, but they hadn't severed the connection completely. "There's one more thing we have to do," Meg said, her voice steady. "We have to destroy the nexus." Charles Wallace hesitated. "But if we do that—" "I know," Meg said softly. "But it's the only way to stop it for good." The dark figure, now nothing more than a shadow, let out a final, desperate wail as the nexus began to collapse in on itself. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking and crumbling as the dimensional folds began to unravel. Meg, Calvin, and Charles Wallace stood together, their hands clasped, as the nexus imploded, its energy exploding outward in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. The nexus was gone, and the dark figure with it. The dimensions were safe. For now. Meg took a deep breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. "We did it." Calvin smiled weakly. "Yeah. We did." But even as they stood there, victorious, Meg couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The nexus may have been destroyed, but the dark force had not been vanquished. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. And Meg knew that when it did, they would have to be ready. The silence that followed the nexus's destruction was thick with an eerie stillness, like the universe itself was holding its breath. Meg, Calvin, and Charles Wallace stood in the center of the chamber, the floor beneath their feet still vibrating with the residual energy of the collapse. The walls, once covered with shifting symbols and runes, were now cracked and silent, as if the life had been drained from the place. Meg's pulse hammered in her ears, and despite their victory, the sense of unease deepened. Something was wrong. They had destroyed the nexus, severed its connection to the dimensional folds, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. It was like the dark force they'd faced wasn't entirely gone. She glanced at Calvin, his face pale, eyes wide with both relief and fear. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the place where the nexus had once stood. Yeah, it's not over, is it? Charles Wallace, still staring at the remnants of the nexus's control point, narrowed his eyes. No. There's something else. I can't explain it, but it's still here, lurking. Meg's heart sank. It wasn't just the destruction of the nexus they needed to worry about. It was what came next. Suddenly, the room trembled again, but this time, the vibrations weren't from the nexus. They were deeper, more sinister, like the very fabric of space was twisting in on itself. A cold gust of wind whipped through the chamber, carrying with it a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Meg's spine. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the shadows. You have merely scratched the surface. Meg's breath hitched. The dark force, the presence that had taunted them, fought them, wasn't defeated. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was regrouping. Stronger. More dangerous. Before she could react, the air in front of them shimmered, and a swirling vortex of darkness began to form. From within its depths, a figure stepped forward, cloaked in shadows, but unmistakably more solid than before. It was the same entity they had faced, but now it was no longer weakened by the nexus. It had used the collapse to free itself from the boundaries of the dimensional folds. It stood tall, its presence overwhelming, its form flickering between reality and something else, something beyond comprehension. The air around it crackled with dark energy, tendrils of shadow licking the floor and walls like serpents. You thought you could destroy me, the entity hissed, its voice dripping with venom. But I am eternal. The nexus was but a fraction of my power. Meg's heart raced as the creature advanced, its cold gaze piercing through her. Calvin stumbled backward, and Charles Wallace gritted his teeth, his brilliant mind working furiously to understand what they were dealing with. We destroyed the nexus. Meg shouted, trying to mask the fears that threatened to choke her. You have no power left. The entity laughed, a low, chilling sound that made Meg's skin crawl. Foolish girl. The nexus was merely a tool. My essence is woven into the very fabric of reality. As long as the dimensions exist, so will I. The ground beneath them trembled again, this time harder, more violent. The walls of the chamber began to crack even further, and the very air seemed to warp, as though reality itself was being pulled apart at the seams. We have to get out of here. Calvin yelled, panic rising in his voice. This place is collapsing. But Meg knew they couldn't just run. The dark force would follow them, haunt them, no matter where they went. They had to find a way to stop it, truly stop it, before it consumed everything. Charles Wallace, his eyes locked on the entity, suddenly spoke with a strange calmness. There's only one way. What? Meg asked, her voice trembling. The dimensions, Charles Wallace began, his gaze intense. We have to go deeper. There's a place, beyond the nexus, beyond the folds. A place where this thing can't reach us. Where we can trap it. Calvin shook his head in disbelief. You're talking about going even further into the unknown? Deeper into dimensions we can barely understand? Charles Wallace nodded, his expression grim. It's the only way. If we stay here, it will tear everything apart. If we go deeper, we might stand a chance. Meg felt her mind whirl with the weight of his words. The thought of diving even further into the dimensions, leaving behind everything they knew, was terrifying. But Charles Wallace was right. They didn't have a choice. The dark force, sensing their plan, surged forward with a roar of fury, its tendrils of shadow lashing out in every direction. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the air grew impossibly cold. Now! Charles Wallace shouted. Without hesitation, Meg grabbed Calvin's hand and reached out for Charles Wallace. Together, they focused, their minds aligning once more with the strange, cosmic energy that had guided them through their journey. The air shimmered around them, and they felt themselves being pulled, drawn into the fabric of reality itself. The chamber began to blur, the walls melting away, the dark force's roar growing distant as they were yanked into the void between dimensions. For a moment, there was nothing. Only darkness, only the cold, suffocating void. But then, slowly, they felt themselves emerge on the other side, into a place unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was a realm of pure, shifting energy. Colors and shapes that defied logic swirled around them, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water. This was the place Charles Wallace had spoken of, the heart of the dimensions, the point where all realities converged. But they weren't alone. The dark force had followed them, though weakened by the journey. It flickered in and out of existence, its form struggling to maintain coherence in this strange new realm. "This is where it ends," Charles Wallace said, his voice steady. "We can trap it here, lock it away forever." Meg nodded, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. "Let's finish this." But as they prepared to confront the dark force one last time, a new ripple of energy surged through the realm, a presence even older, more powerful than the dark force itself. Meg's eyes widened in shock. "What is that?" Charles Wallace's face paled. "I don't know, but we may have just awakened something far worse." The air crackled with tension as the dark force let out a low growl, its attention suddenly shifting away from them, toward the new presence that was beginning to take shape. Meg, Calvin, and Charles Wallace stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. They had thought the nexus was the end, but now they realized it was only the beginning. The presence that had emerged from the swirling vortex of energy seemed to defy all understanding. It wasn't like the dark force they had been battling, not some shadowy, malevolent entity seeking to destroy or control. No, this was something far more ancient, far more incomprehensible, a force that had existed since before time, before space, before the dimensions had even formed. The very air around it warped and shimmered, as though reality itself was bending to its will. Colors shifted in ways that defied description, rippling through the spectrum in patterns that made Meg's head spin. Her pulse quickened as she felt the weight of this new presence bearing down on them, pressing into her mind, her soul, like the touch of something infinite. Charles Wallace stepped forward, his eyes wide, transfixed by the entity's arrival. His expression was no longer one of determination or confidence, but of awe, and perhaps a touch of fear. This is beyond anything I could have predicted," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of energy in the air. The dark force that had followed them into this realm recoiled, its once terrifying form now flickering with uncertainty. It hissed, its voice crackling like static, but even it seemed hesitant to confront this new presence. "We need to get out of here," Calvin whispered urgently, tugging at Meg's arm. "Whatever that thing is, we can't face it. We're not ready." Meg's heart raced, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her mind racing with questions. What was this thing? Had they really stumbled into something even worse than the dark force? Or was this something else entirely, something that held the key to everything they had been searching for? The ancient presence seemed to regard them for a moment, as if considering their very existence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it extended what could only be described as tendrils of light, tendrils that shimmered and shifted like the flow of time itself. They reached out, not toward Meg or Calvin, but toward the dark force. For the first time since their journey began, Meg saw something she had never expected, fear in the eyes of their enemy. The dark force screeched, its form distorting as the tendrils of light wrapped around it, binding it, pulling it into the shifting vortex. It struggled, writhing, but it was no match for the ancient presence. In moments, the dark force was consumed, swallowed whole by the light, and then it was gone, erased from existence as though it had never been. For a brief, dizzying moment, silence filled the realm. The energy around them calmed, the colors settling into a steady, pulsing rhythm. But Meg knew better than to relax. This was far from over. Charles Wallace took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the ancient presence. It didn't destroy the dark force," he said, his voice trembling with realization. "It absorbed it. It's taking its power." Meg's blood ran cold at his words. This presence, whatever it was, wasn't just a neutral force, it was a devourer, a collector of power. And now it had the strength of the very entity they had spent so long trying to defeat. As if hearing their thoughts, the ancient presence began to shift once more. The tendrils of light receded, and its form grew more defined, more tangible. It no longer flickered in and out of reality, but stood before them like a living, breathing being, though it was unlike anything Meg had ever seen. It had no face, no distinct features, just a swirling mass of energy that pulsed with a quiet, terrifying intensity. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts, deep, resonating thoughts that echoed through their minds like the tolling of a bell. You have entered a place beyond your understanding. You have disrupted the balance. Now, you must decide. Meg's breath caught in her throat. Decide what? The fate of all things, the presence replied. The dark force was but one piece of the puzzle. There are others. Forces that shape the fabric of reality. Forces that you cannot comprehend. You have set events into motion that cannot be undone. Now, you must choose how it ends. Meg's heart pounded in her chest. But we didn't ask for this. We just wanted to save my father, to stop the dark force from destroying everything. The presence pulsed with a strange, almost sympathetic energy. The path you chose has led you here. There is no going back. But there is always a choice. Charles Wallace stepped forward, his voice steady despite the enormity of the situation. What choice? What do we have to do? The presence's tendrils of light shifted, pointing toward the distant horizon, where the edges of this strange dimension blurred into the void. Beyond this place lies a nexus. A convergence of realities, of possibilities. If you reach it, you can reshape the future. You can restore balance, or you can unravel everything. Meg's mind spun with the weight of the decision before them. She had come so far, fought so hard to save her family, her world. But now, the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The fate of not just her reality, but all realities, rested in her hands. Meg, Calvin's voice was soft, filled with uncertainty. What are we going to do? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she knew one thing for certain, they couldn't turn back. They had to face whatever lay ahead, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, she nodded toward the horizon. We go forward. As they began to walk toward the nexus, the presence watched them in silence, its form slowly fading back into the shifting energy of the realm. But its final words lingered in Meg's mind, echoing with a chilling certainty. The end is near. Choose wisely. The journey was far from over. As Meg, Charles Wallace, and Calvin moved forward, the air crackled with an electric tension. Each step felt like a defiance of the unknown, a challenge to the very forces that sought to manipulate their destiny. The landscape around them twisted and morphed, reflecting the tumultuous nature of their quest. At times, it felt as though the ground beneath their feet was alive, pulsing with energy that resonated with their fears and hopes. The horizon shimmered with a kaleidoscope of colors, each hue shifting in rhythm with the three travelers' emotions. Meg could feel the weight of her father's absence pressing down on her, a reminder of the stakes involved. Every moment brought her closer to the nexus, yet every moment also deepened the uncertainty about what awaited them there. Do you think the nexus will help us find Dad? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had fallen slightly behind, a pensive look etched on his face as he tried to comprehend the enormity of their journey. I have to believe it will, Meg replied, her resolve hardening. We've come this far. We can't give up now. Yet, even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. The ancient presence had spoken of choices, of balance. What if the nexus held more dangers than they could imagine? Calvin glanced back at Meg, his brow furrowed in thought. What if we're not ready for what's waiting for us? The dark force was just the beginning. What if this nexus is worse? We'll face it together, Meg insisted. No matter what it is. But the conviction in her voice felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. They were hurtling toward an unknown that could change everything. As they approached the nexus, the air thickened with anticipation. A swirling vortex of light and shadow loomed before them, beckoning them closer with a siren's call. It radiated an almost palpable energy, pulsing with the combined essence of countless realities. Meg felt a strange compulsion to step into it, to let the light engulf her and guide her to whatever awaited inside. "Stay together," she shouted, reaching for her brother's hand and pulling Calvin closer. The last thing she wanted was to lose either of them in this chaotic swirl. They stepped forward, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the world around them exploded into a kaleidoscope of sound and sensation. In an instant, they were no longer in the realm they had known. Instead, they found themselves standing on a vast expanse that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The ground shimmered like glass, and above them, swirling clouds of color drifted, shifting and swirling in a cosmic dance. This was the nexus, a place where the very fabric of reality intertwined. But even amid the beauty, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. The calmness felt deceptive, as if the tranquility was merely a mask hiding something darker. Whispers filled Meg's ears, voices echoing from alternate dimensions, snippets of conversations that felt both familiar and alien. They tugged at her consciousness, urging her to listen, to understand. "Meg." Charles's voice broke through the cacophony, sharp and urgent. "Look." Ahead, an enormous structure loomed, a towering spire that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. It was a monument unlike any Meg had ever seen, forged from a material that glimmered like stars. As they approached, the whispers intensified, wrapping around them like tendrils, drawing them toward the spire. "What is it?" Calvin asked, a mix of awe and fear in his eyes. "I don't know," Meg replied, her heart racing. "But I think we need to find out." She felt an undeniable pull toward the structure, as if it were a magnet drawing her in. It was a feeling that both terrified and exhilarated her. As they reached the base of the spire, the whispers became clearer, forming words that resonated in their minds. "Welcome, seekers of truth," the voices chorused. "You have entered the heart of the nexus, a place where destinies converge." "Destinies?" Charles echoed, confusion lacing his words. "What do you mean?" "You stand on the brink of transformation," the voices intoned. "Choices made here will shape not only your own reality but the fabric of the multiverse. Will you embrace the unknown and forge your path, or will you succumb to fear and retreat?" The question hung in the air, heavy with significance. Meg glanced at Charles and Calvin, searching their faces for answers. The weight of their decision pressed down on her, and she felt the familiar tug of doubt creeping back in. Could they truly bear the weight of such power? "Meg, we have to decide," Calvin urged, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "What do we want to do?" Meg inhaled sharply, realizing the truth in his words. They couldn't afford to hesitate. They had come too far, faced too many dangers, and now they were standing before an opportunity that could change everything. Her father's face flashed in her mind, a reminder of why she was here. "We have to find Dad. We have to save him. That's our choice." "Then let's make it," Charles said, his determination returning. He stepped forward, reaching out to touch the surface of the spire. As his fingers made contact, the structure vibrated with energy, and a rush of light enveloped them. Suddenly, images flooded Meg's mind, visions of her father, moments from their past, glimmers of futures yet to come. She saw herself in a myriad of alternate realities, each path diverging in ways she could never have imagined. Choices made and unmade, lives lived and lost. But in the chaos of possibilities, one image stood out, her father, trapped in darkness, a flicker of hope in his eyes. It ignited a fire within her, a resolve that shattered the lingering doubts. "We can't let him stay there," she breathed. "We have to reach him." As she and her brother stood at the threshold of the spire, the path ahead twisted and turned like a labyrinth, each corridor filled with echoes of the choices they had made. They could feel the weight of those choices pressing down on them, the gravity of their pasts and futures intertwining in ways that threatened to pull them apart. "What if we get lost in there?" Calvin asked, uncertainty creeping back into his voice. "We won't," Meg assured him. "We'll stick together, no matter what." She could feel the connection between them strengthening, a bond that transcended the chaos around them. It was that bond that had brought them this far, and it would carry them through whatever awaited within the spire. With a final glance at each other, they took a deep breath and stepped into the heart of the spire, the swirling energy of the nexus enveloping them once more. The corridors shifted and changed as they walked, each step echoing with the weight of their choices. They moved deeper into the spire, their surroundings shifting with every decision they made. They encountered rooms filled with echoes of their past, shadowy figures that mirrored their doubts and fears. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and Meg could feel the weight of the choices they had made in every fiber of her being. In one chamber, they found a reflection of Meg's life, moments of happiness with her family, the laughter shared with her father, and the warmth of their bond. But just as quickly, the vision morphed into one filled with shadows, her father's absence casting a pall over everything. It hurt to see, but it also fueled her resolve. They needed to push through, to find him before the darkness consumed everything. "Keep moving," Meg urged, her heart racing. "We're almost there." They pressed on, navigating through corridors that shifted like liquid light. Suddenly, they reached a vast chamber at the center of the spire, illuminated by a blinding brilliance that took their breath away. In the center stood a pulsating orb of energy, a swirling mass of colors that seemed to contain the essence of the nexus itself. "Is that it?" Calvin breathed, off-filling his voice. "I think so," Meg said, stepping closer. The orb radiated warmth, inviting them forward. "It feels alive." But as they approached, shadows began to stretch across the chamber, rising from the corners and wrapping around the orb like dark tendrils. Meg's heart raced as she sensed the dark force returning, not defeated, but emboldened by their journey. "Not again!" Charles shouted, clenching his fists. "We have to stop it." Meg steeled herself, the vision of her father still vivid in her mind. "We can't let it take the orb. It's our only chance to save him." The shadows writhed, merging into a formidable shape, a figure of darkness that loomed over them, an embodiment of all their fears. "You think you can wield the power of the nexus?" it taunted, its voice like ice. "You are nothing but children, lost in a world far beyond your comprehension." "We may be children," Meg shot back, anger flaring within her. "But we have something you don't, hope." She reached out, her hand trembling as she connected with the orb. A surge of energy pulsed through her, igniting a fire within her soul. "Meg!" Calvin yelled, fear in his voice as he stepped closer. "What are you doing?" "I'm not letting it win," she cried, the energy from the orb wrapping around her like a protective shield. In that moment, she felt a surge of power flow through her, connecting her to the very essence of the nexus. Images flashed before her eyes. The lives that had been touched by the dark force, the people who had suffered because of it. She couldn't let it continue. With a determined cry, she unleashed the energy, sending a wave of light surging toward the dark figure. The shadows recoiled, and the room exploded with light as the clash of power erupted in a brilliant display. "Together!" Charles shouted, joining her. "We can do this!" Calvin stepped forward, placing his hands on the orb as well, and together they formed a triad of light and hope. The darkness writhed, trying to push back against their combined energy, but the light surged stronger, illuminating the chamber with an intensity that felt like the dawn of a new day. "Focus on Dad!" Meg shouted, her heart pounding. "We have to bring him back." As they channeled their energy into the orb, the darkness began to fade, replaced by flashes of light, visions of their father, trapped but reaching out for them. The connection was almost palpable, a thread binding them across the expanse of the universe. "Hold on," she urged, tears filling her eyes. "We're coming for you." With one final surge of strength, they unleashed their combined power into the orb, a burst of light that shattered the darkness and filled the chamber with warmth and hope. The dark figure shrieked, its form dissipating into nothingness as the energy enveloped them in a cocoon of brilliance. And in that moment of triumph, they felt it, the connection to their father solidifying, a bridge forming between their hearts and his. The light surged, and the chamber began to transform, reshaping itself into something new, a doorway, an exit leading them back to where their journey had begun. "We did it!" Calvin gasped, a mixture of disbelief and joy flooding his voice. But Meg's heart raced with urgency. "This isn't over. We have to get to him before it's too late." As they rushed toward the doorway, the remnants of the nexus shimmered around them, the energy crackling with potential. They had faced the darkness, but now they had to embrace the light, had to find their way back to their father before the shadows could reclaim him. With one last look at the pulsating orb, Meg steeled herself for the next phase of their journey. She wouldn't let fear dictate their path. They were going to save him. They were going to finish what they had started. Meg, Calvin, and Charles Wallace burst through the shimmering doorway, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The light enveloped them, guiding them back through the corridors of space and time until they found themselves standing on a distant planet, the dark energy of the nexus swirling in the sky above. Before them, trapped within a field of shadows, stood their father. "Dad!" Meg cried out, running toward him. She could feel the dark energy trying to pull her back, but the light from the nexus still coursed through her, strengthening her resolve. She reached out, her hand passing through the barrier of shadows that surrounded him. For a brief moment, her father's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come for me," he whispered, his voice weak but laced with love. "It's too dangerous. The darkness, it's stronger than I thought." "We're not leaving without you," Meg insisted, gripping his hand tightly. "We've come too far to give up now." Calvin and Charles Wallace joined her, their hands clasping the other side of the barrier. Together, they channeled the remaining energy from the nexus, letting the light flow from their hearts into the shadowy prison. The darkness writhed and resisted, but the power of their bond was stronger than any evil force. Bit by bit, the shadows peeled away, until finally, their father was free. The moment his feet touched the ground, the landscape around them began to change. The oppressive gloom lifted, the skies cleared, and the swirling energy of the nexus began to calm. It was as if the entire planet was healing, responding to the triumph of hope and love over fear and darkness. "Thank you," their father whispered, pulling them into an embrace. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at his children, the ones who had risked everything to save him. As the sky brightened and the echoes of the nexus faded, Meg realized that their journey wasn't just about saving their father. It was about discovering the strength within themselves to face the unknown, to confront their fears, and to trust in the power of unity and love. The dark force had been defeated, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. Later, as they prepared to leave the planet, Meg looked up at the stars and smiled. The universe was vast, and there were many more challenges to face. But she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And together, they would always find the light in the darkness.